tell us when things are ready.
Okay.
Yes, I forgot there's a bit of a delay with YouTube streaming.
Yeah,
I don't do it very often.
So I guess we're live now.
Yes.
Super.
Yes.
Can we go?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So good morning, bom dia, good afternoon. Our special guest in Greece, in Athens, Laura Patsko. So this is one more meeting of our English as a Lingua Franca research group from Bahia Federal University. And today we have the pleasure of having here with us Laura Patsko, directly from beautiful Athens.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to introduce Laura a little bit, and then as usual, she's going to talk for around 30-40 minutes, and then later she'll take questions, comments, and suggestions, etc., etc. All right. So Laura is an experienced researcher and trainer who now works independently as a learning experience designer, specializing in teacher training, pronunciation, and how to use English clearly and effectively when communicating with international audiences. I forgot to say that I had the pleasure to meet Laura, I believe, in Italy, and then later in Greece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was really impressed with her presentation and also expertise while she was still living in London. And, Laura has a lot of experience with this topic. So she's the author and co-author of various books, chapters, and articles on these topics, and edited the Journal of the ITEFL Pronunciation a Special Interest Group for several years. She holds a BA in Linguistics from Reading University and an MA in ELT in Applied Linguistics from King's College, London. Although Laura has lived in London for a long time, if I'm not mistaken, you're from the States, right, Laura?
I was born in the States, but I'm half English, so I actually lived most of my life in England, and I just never completely lost the accent.
Yeah, I remember. I remember that piece of information. Yeah.
Yeah, well remembered.
Yeah. Anyway, so Laura sent the group a section of the book How to Write Pronunciation Activities.
This one?
That she co-authored independently with Katie Simpson. Mm-hmm. And that she's going to talk a little bit about, use some of the examples taken from this book. So her presentation today will be pronunciation materials for ELF. As we know, researchers, teachers, besides this whole question, how can we teach ELF? So pronunciation is still a very controversial topic when it comes to teaching ELF in different contexts. So then it's good that we have here teachers and researchers from different local contexts, public schools, private schools, university. So I think it will be really wonderful to hear a specialist in this area. And because sometimes, as she says in her writing, is that if the teacher usually, depending on the situation, avoids teaching pronunciation because of different, factors. So Laura, welcome. Thank you very much again for taking this invitation. It's a pleasure to see you, despite being online. But we're very glad that you accepted this invitation. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I completely forgive you for not flying me all the way to my beloved Brazil. Next time I have the chance, I'll come in person.
Yes,
I would love to come back.
Absolutely.
I would love to come back. And thank you all for making time in your Friday morning to talk about geeky things like research and ELF and pronunciation. Shall I share my screen now? And you can just tell me if you can see the slides. So you should see very soon a nice bright yellow slide. Yeah. And I'm also going to just get the chat open in front of me on my other screen. That way, if you send messages to me while I'm talking, I can see them. So, gosh, where to begin? It's very difficult to know where to begin with a topic like this because of all the different training and teaching and discussion and things that I've done, like all of us, I guess. This is the one where I find the audience is most heterogeneous. Like everybody has such a different level of comfort and familiarity with either pronunciation or English as a lingua franca or both. People have really quite widely varying opinions on the topics. And that makes it really difficult to know how to talk to any group because we're just so diverse in our backgrounds and in our existing knowledge. So with that in mind, actually, this is a really nice event to do, knowing that I've already sent something for you to read and you have an idea of where I'm coming from. Now, Savio mentioned that I did my master's degree in ELT in applied linguistics at King's College in London. And when I started that degree, I didn't really know a lot about English as a lingua franca. I had come across one of the main names in the field, Professor Jennifer Jenkins, via my teacher training some years previously, where they showed us a website called TEFL Villains. And that was all I knew about English as a lingua franca was there's some terrifying, concept out there. And I knew nothing else about it and nobody talked about it. And I even, for my final assessment for my diploma in teaching, my Delta, I did a pronunciation lesson. And even then I had no idea about this whole area. So when I decided to do my master's, that was all I had in my head. I didn't intend to focus on this area, but I was teaching at the time and teacher training in London, which is, according to some sources, the most multilingual city in the world. And I had groups of students who were, by definition, using English as their lingua franca every day in the classroom because they came from all over the world. In one class of 10 students, I might have someone from Brazil, Spain, Russia, China, Japan, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, I mean, in one classroom. And I found that what I was teaching in terms of pronunciation wasn't really helping them. They didn't need to sound British or like they were from Britain, and they're not. But also the things that we were emphasizing as making them sort of easier or harder to understand were all designed for the benefit of a listener whose first language is English. And that's not who they were using English with, rather. So when I started doing my master's and reading more about linguistic research and realizing that there's a whole field of inquiry focused on that use of English, that became really interesting and exciting to me because it was my everyday experience. And I'm very practically minded. I like to know what to do, and I thought, well, okay, I'm convinced, I understand all the theory, I've read the research, but what do I do in my classroom? There's no material available for teachers who want to focus on intelligibility internationally. There's loads of material for sounding British or talking to Americans. There's nothing for ELF at the time. That is changing. So that's kind of where I started getting into this. And with that in mind, I'll come back to this, but Katie Simpson and I, who met at a conference, like so many people do, like I met you, Savio, we started talking about this and she was in a really similar position. So all of the materials that we were creating for our classrooms, we started to collect on a blog and share them because we were so frustrated that there was nothing else available. So that's the kind of background picture of why I ended up interested in this field. And making a lot of stuff. I never had it in my mind to publish anything. It wasn't an ambition, but I was so frustrated by there being nothing written down, nothing published, nothing credible that teachers could take and use in their classrooms. So that's where this book came from. So all of that to say that what I'd really like to do is focus on the practical side of things in this talk, workshop, forum, whatever we're calling it. But I will just quite quickly summarize some of the theoretical background. And I am assuming, because of the nature of your research group, that you already know quite a lot about ELF, you've done a lot of the reading, this is not new to you. However, I have found that even in the field of applied linguistics that focuses on ELF or ELF or whatever you want to call it, very few people focus on pronunciation. So I will spend a little bit more time talking about the phonology side, and please forgive me if you're really excited about pronunciation and you already know it all. I'm also conscious that I have no idea who is watching on YouTube, and they might not be as experienced as you. So I'll try to put something for everybody. And I'm more than happy to share my slides later if anybody wants to go back and read things again. There's references at the end if you want further reading. So just ask me at the end and we can arrange that. So this is what we're going to look at. These are my two worlds that I'm bringing together. The overlap between English as a lingua franca and ELT pronunciation materials. So we'll have a bit of discussion. We'll try and do some practical things, and hopefully we'll have time to try an exercise from this book. So, quick summary of what I'm talking about when I talk about English as a lingua franca. So very commonly cited statistic is this one, that approximately 80% of all the spoken interaction in English in the world takes place with no native speaker present. Now, the definition of native speaker is hugely problematic, as I'm sure we all know, but I'm not going to talk about that now. Let's assume that we're talking about the typical, traditional, probably inaccurate description of a person who speaks English as their first and only language. So most of the English happening in the world doesn't involve any people like that. One very conservative estimate is that for every so-called native speaker, there are 3 people who are using English as their second language. But David Crystal himself has said elsewhere that this is very conservative, and it's so hard to count speakers and users of a language. But you know, if you publish something, it's open to critique. So he was being careful, but he thinks it's probably more like 5 to 1. And so we're talking about a difference between English as a foreign language, where we are assuming that the learner is using English in an English-speaking majority community like Britain or New Zealand, let's say, and English as a lingua franca, so it being their language of communication. So we're straight away from the beginning throwing out of the window this traditional ELT assumption that the person listening is a native speaker of English. So when we're talking about teaching pronunciation, almost every ELT book that you open just assumes that we're trying to change the learner's pronunciation so that it's acceptable and understandable to one of these mysterious, mythical, monolingual native English speakers. And we're throwing that out the window from the beginning, which again, I'm sure you all know in this group. I'm not sure who's joining online on YouTube, but this is one of the most important things I think to establish from the very beginning. The person listening probably doesn't have English as a first language, and that will influence their expectations culturally, linguistically, just acoustically, mentally. Their brain has not been preparing them for such a wide range of voices. And so, yes, to summarize, this is what I'm talking about, that in most interactions in English nowadays, English is not the first language of all the speakers or any of the speakers, and they might not share the same first language. So we, for example, are all speaking in English now in this seminar. I assume you were doing that for my benefit because I saw some Portuguese in the chat box. So we're not even talking about a context where people are using English because why not? It's convenient, or it's easy, and they have another first language that they share. So all of the people in these interactions potentially come from different cultural backgrounds, different language backgrounds, and so on. And they're using English probably because it's their communicative medium of choice. And it's often the only option. Now, again, there are many, many definitions of ELF. This is one that I like because it highlights the importance of choice, and when there isn't a choice, the fact that sometimes there's only one option. So I know living in Athens, for example, I often hear people using English who none of them seem particularly comfortable using it, but they have no other option. And they know that if they're going to communicate effectively or partly effectively, it'll be in a language like English, which both of them know a little bit of. So we're quite far removed from the idealized world of the ELT coursebook. And just specifically to talk about Brazil, in your context, you may or may not know some of these statistics. I did a bit of research to find out. Obviously, a lot more people than people outside Brazil realize. And of all those people, millions and millions and millions compulsorily learning English. Obviously, English for many people is a language of business and of tourism when tourism is allowed. So pandemics notwithstanding. And a lot of the major business is conducted with these groups. So Americans, Germans, Chinese, Japanese. You'll note that a minority here can be assumed to have English as a first language. So just to illustrate that this is very much the case in Brazil, as it is in many other countries, that actually geographically, it doesn't really matter anymore where you are. And increasingly so with the global pandemic and everybody online, it's not really about where you are or where you're from. It's about who you're communicating with and why. And so again, if you start from that point, then your conclusions about what pronunciation is useful to teach come out completely different. So we've got some new challenges, some new aims. Again, I'm just going to share a couple of my favorite definitions from literature, because there's a huge literature on this, on intelligibility, and people talking about intelligibility, comprehensibility, all of these terms. I find it useful to gloss that and just say, like, what are we talking about? This is one of my favorites. So the extent to which a speaker's message is actually understood by a listener. And I like that because it's not entirely about the kind of phonetic signal. It's also partly about what the person was trying to say. You know, if somebody, let's say, mispronounces something, whatever that means, did I understand what they were saying? You know, it doesn't matter if that matched exactly with this other speaker's pronunciation, but did I understand their message? And perhaps more concretely, it's about identifying words. So as a listener, just being able to identify the words that were said and understand the speaker's intended meaning. So this means from an ELF perspective, then as teachers, we need to choose our materials or choose from our materials, maybe with a more critical eye. We're kind of looking through ELF glasses, ELF goggles. Sounds really strange. ELF, let's say ELF, ELF goggles sounds completely strange. You know, we're looking at our course materials through this lens of actually how much of this is relevant to my students and their needs. How, you know, am I going to use all of this exercise? Will I use it at all? Will I create my own? And we also need to redefine what we mean by error. Robin Walker talks about this very clearly in his book, which is remarkably now 10 years old. I can't believe it. But really redefining what we mean by error, because of course, an error really is just a deviation from an expectation. But at the beginning of this talk, we said we're changing our expectations. We've thrown those old ones out the window. So what is an error? What are we deviating from? You know, if we've moved the expectation, you know, moved the benchmark or whatever you want to call it. And we've got new opportunities. So the great news, the best news, is being a non-native English-speaking teacher or native English-speaking teacher, for want of a better word, is not a critical factor in being effective as a pronunciation teacher. And I think this is one of those areas of really tremendous insecurity among even very experienced teachers, and even teachers who, you know, feel would identify as a native speaker, is this idea that I don't sound like the voice in the book, and therefore I can't teach pronunciation. That is categorically not true. And it's intuitively appealing, but it's not supported by research into intelligibility and into teaching pronunciation. And there's also some advantages, particularly if you have the same first language as your students, which of course in London was unrealistic for me. I don't and didn't and probably couldn't fluently speak all of the languages of all of the students in my classroom. But if you do share their language, then you have an advantage as a bilingual teacher. And that makes you a really good role model of L2 English, because you've done it. You know, you've done exactly what you're asking them to do. You followed those steps. You can empathize in a way that I never can. I never can. So there's a huge advantage there. And the other thing, of course, is that when you have a narrower focus, and in a moment we'll look at the lingua franca core, so the kind of list of pronunciation features that are often recommended for this goal, you can be more efficient. So you narrow your focus, you know, you have more time to spend on things that matter, and you don't spend time on things that don't matter. And I have never yet met a teacher who said, no, I don't need more time. I've got loads of time. I can cover everything in the curriculum, no trouble. No, we need to narrow our focus. We need to prioritize. And I find that once you're confronted with the reality that most of the learners in the world now are learning English to use it in international settings with a wide range of people, then our priority is almost always English as a lingua franca. Not always, but almost always. And it's a good place to begin. If we don't know, and sometimes we don't, who our students are interacting with or who they will be interacting with, we can take a reasonable guess that they're probably going to be using it in very mixed linguistic and cultural groups. So that's the kind of hooray, ELF, positive, ELF evangelist kind of side. And now we have to look at the reality of how things work in the world, which is that there's a market out there, and most people making pronunciation materials want to sell the materials so they can, do amazing things like eat and pay rent. And that market and their demands and their needs do have a really huge influence on what publishers will produce. I worked at a major publisher for 3 years, and I really learned a lot about the pressure they're under. And this is another reason why I believe so strongly that you have to make things practical and enjoyable and help people see that this is relevant to them. Because it's actually not that hard, I find, to have a dialogue about the principles and the theory and the research and to convince people that this is meaningful and worthwhile. But it's really hard to translate that into classroom practice. And so lots of people, after sort of thinking about English as a lingua franca and the statistics of usage and their classrooms, a lot of people are happy to adopt such an approach, but they don't know how. They don't know how to begin. And the people who haven't had that discussion and that dialogue don't even engage. So working at a publisher was really interesting for me to see how important it is to make good materials that are useful, that students really learn from and improve from, instead of just constantly feeling frustrated that, okay, I don't sound like that CD. I don't know how to make that sound. What does it matter anyway? Sometimes they realize before we realize that what we're teaching them isn't very useful for them. So thinking a little bit about what the markets demand and what markets need. And the demands, it's important to remember, are very much influenced by us as an industry. So there's this kind of attitude in a lot of the big business publishing, at least, that you've got to give the people what they want, and they want native speakers. But we know that the vast majority of the world's English users don't speak with a standard, so-called standard accent or a native-like accent. And we also know from people who research intelligibility that accent and intelligibility are entirely separate things, which again is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but having a particular accent and being easy to understand are completely different. So much of it is down to expectation. And the example that I always love to give is that of Glasgow. Poor Glaswegians have such a reputation in the world, oh, nobody understands these people. What are they talking? I don't know. Their accent is so terrible. Well, if you go to Glasgow, you realize they all understand each other perfectly. There's nothing inherently in the sounds they're making which is more or less understandable, but the expectations of the listener are different and they're aligned, the speaker and the listener. So in any community where you have certain expectations of hearing certain things and then people don't follow those expectations, you will feel like you didn't understand and you might blame the accent, but they're not really the same phenomena. They just overlap and they happen at a similar time, so it kind of confuses us, but they're different things completely. And these two researchers in particular, Tracy Derwing and Murray Monroe, have done a lot of really interesting and very, very readable, accessible research on this topic. So I'd really recommend reading their work. And also there is ample research evidence, so much evidence, that native speakers, particularly monolingual native speakers, are often the most difficult to understand in international settings. These are just a few examples of studies. The earliest study I know of on this topic was published in 1979, and it's 2020 now. Why are we still hanging on to this myth that the best and most widely understood speaker of English must have it as their first language? I wasn't even born in 1979. Like, this is not new news. There's been so much research in this area. So yeah, there's kind of a problem that we have created as an industry. We've created this vicious cycle, this idea that students or somebody says only standard native like English is acceptable. And so your students, being consumers and wanting to make fast progress when they pay a lot of money for their course, say, great, okay, give me that. That's all I want. And then because they say that, we say, hey, look what they're saying. They're saying this is what they want. So we offer it. And we just get stuck in this perpetual loop of offering what people say they want because we've told them to say they want it. And then, you know, it's madness. It's really madness. So we have a lot of work to do as an industry to unteach some of these mistaken and now different assumptions that may have been true decades ago when the world was a different place. But this is just not the world that we live in now. And I think we have a professional and a moral responsibility to start undoing what we've done in that respect. So this is often how I see this relationship in ELT. You've got this sort of history of the industry standing there going, no, 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 must be native speaker, and native speaker is best. That's the only thing that's acceptable. That's what everybody understands. And then you've got like the rest of the world going, come on now, catch up with reality, please. I don't use English with native speakers. I don't need to sound like one. I'm from Brazil. That's amazing. I have an accent. Cool. You know, there's this sort of tension. And of course, the risk is that we're trying to please everybody and we end up just falling into the abyss and dying a terrible pronunciation death. So really, this is what we're asking people to do. We're asking them to take a leap of faith. We're saying, look, trust me, jump, and you will land on solid ground. There is plenty of evidence for this approach that we're taking. And there's also plenty of anecdotal evidence too. I mean, again, I think a lot of students in my classroom in London knew better than me, before me, that what they needed was for everybody in London to understand them and vice versa. And that was a very international place with lots of transient linguistic communities, lots of dynamic communication. So we're asking people to take a leap of faith, but as I said, they need help doing that, and it needs to be practical, or else it's just words and ideas. We're trying to ask them to move basically from seeing the world like this, very simple. Here's a speaker, here's a listener. It's all happy, all matches, nice and clean. Stop seeing the world like that and see it like this. Look at all this color, look at all this diversity and movement, and you know, this is how the world really is. And what are we trying to do in our classrooms when we're teaching pronunciation? You know, do we want to teach it how it might, you know, how we might like it to be, or what would be easier? Or do we want to teach what the world really is like? You know, we don't want to contribute, or I don't want to contribute personally to that feeling that so many learners have where they leave the classroom, they think, God, I've been doing this for years and I still don't understand anybody and nobody understands me. I don't want to contribute to that anymore. And I really feel that a lot of the problems have been created by this reductive, simplistic view of how people sound and what they expect to hear. So I've talked a lot about being practical, and I really want to have a go at doing some practical things. So let's summarize the principles. All of this can be captured in this concept that we're talking about: evolution, not revolution. We don't have to change everything we've ever done. We don't need to completely destroy all of the pronunciation activities that we used to use, which were useful. We're just redefining what an error is, and we're prioritizing certain features. So if you received and had a chance to read the chapter that I sent and the beginning of the next chapter, so it was chapter 4 and a little bit of chapter 5 of this book of how to write pronunciation activities, then this should be familiar to you. And so I won't spend too long talking about this, but just to summarize, some basic principles for writing or pronunciation materials. You've got to identify appropriate priorities for your syllabus. And the first language will have a big influence on this, which is something that's quite difficult, of course, for publishers because they're going to sell their books in many different places. So as a teacher who knows your student and possibly knows their first language, you're probably in a better position to identify priorities. And we'll come back in a moment to this concept of the lingua franca core, which I mentioned. And you're going to identify the key markets for the course. Now, this I'm referring more to people who work for publishers, not just teachers in their classroom, but people who are going to create a course that will be very widely used. So this may not be relevant for you if you're a practicing teacher and not working in a large scale publishing operation. But if you are developing a course that you want to exist and to sell into many different markets, you need to cover the needs of speakers from those L1 groups, those particular first languages. You know, if I want to sell my course book in South America, Central America, Latin America, I'll probably have to cover Portuguese and Spanish as first languages, and potentially others. You also need to distinguish between the productive and the receptive focus in your activities. So again, as I mentioned in the chapter, there are different things. What students need to be able to understand is not necessarily the same as what they need to be able to produce. And when you put together an activity, it's useful to think of that. You know, what am I trying to develop here? Their listening or their speech? And generally speaking, I would still start with the receptive. It's almost always easier to produce something once you are able to recognize it, once you can hear it. So in terms of sequencing and staging, it's probably best to start by developing listening and then moving on to speech. This one is super important in terms of receptive skills, is including a variety of authentic accents in your materials. Because if we're assuming that students need to be able to understand people from all over the world in different first languages, and they need exposure to that, then they have to be real speakers with those accents. And this is one of the biggest problems that major publishers have, is because they will hire actors for a day or two to do all the voices for their recordings in their books. And if there's, say, a French speaker in the recording, it'll be an actor doing a French accent. And I understand why it happens. I understand the limitations, but personally, it really, really bothers me that that happens, because it completely defeats the object of exposing the learners to other accents, because they're not real. That's not how a French speaker speaks. That's how a British actor doing a French accent speaks. And that's different. And if your learners need to listen to British actors doing French accents, great. But if they need to work with, you know, their French colleagues in a French company, then that recording isn't going to help them. So as far as possible, you want to include a variety of genuine, authentic accents. And that can be scary. I absolutely understand that feeling. You hit play and you think, gosh, I don't know, where am I going to start helping my students understand this? I don't know what they're doing. I don't speak French. I'm not an expert. But again, what are we really trying to do? Are we trying to help our students communicate in the world, or are we trying to simplify it so we feel comfortable? Maybe a little of both, if we're honest. This one is really key, and this is what was in the reading as well that I sent, is that pronunciation can and should be integrated with other skills. So your phonological awareness influences not only your speaking and listening, but it also influences your reading, your writing, your grammar. You know, think of all the students that you have who never really kind of get to use this grammar point, and then you discover when they're in upper intermediate level, it's because they don't know how to say it, and they just never really use it and they avoid it. You know, so pronunciation should definitely be integrated through your whole syllabus. You also want to repeat the key features across multiple levels. So the first thing I said is identify appropriate priorities. Now I'm saying you need to revisit those priorities, because as we all know as teachers, just because you taught something once or practiced it a few times doesn't mean that it comes naturally. And one of the biggest challenges with pronunciation is that it's physical. Like, you're retraining your muscles. Imagine if somebody told you now, okay, you need to walk differently. Change the way you walk. Don't put your foot there, put it here. You think, I don't know, I've been walking my entire life. I don't know how I walk. How do I change this? You're changing someone's actual muscular habits, and that takes time. So you need to repeat things across multiple levels. Don't just include it once and then trust that it's done. Similarly, don't forget to revise and review pronunciation. Almost every course book I've ever worked with has a review section at the end of a unit or 2 units or something that has grammar and vocab. They never have pronunciation. It's really rare. Even the books that include pronunciation in the unit, they don't review it at the end, which just gives the impression that it wasn't important. And then every subsequent unit, the teacher is busy, they don't have time. Guess what they skip? The one that never comes back, the one that is apparently unimportant. Okay, a couple more principles, and then we're going to try an activity. This is particularly relevant to ELF, so avoiding possessive or prescriptive phrasing in your task rubric, in your instructions. So things like we say, well, who is we? You know, what group does the book belong to that the learner doesn't? Or, you know, this is correct, which again may feel counterintuitive in a language classroom, but for something like pronunciation, which is so variable and so tied to individual identity, how can I say, no, your identity is incorrect. The identity of the speaker on this page, this is correct. So it's probably more helpful, more constructive, and more accurate to say, you know, some speakers say, or even most speakers say, depending on what audiences you're working with, or this is clear, because that's our goal. Remember, from an ELF perspective, our goal is clarity, not correctness according to one group's norms. And finally, in terms of design, so again, if you're making worksheets for your classroom, you may not care so much about how it's presented on the page, but particularly if you are putting pronunciation into a course of materials, like a course book or a whole course for online delivery, you really want to make sure the design is consistent with other sections which are important. And this is a really interesting finding from this research paper from a couple of years ago, that often books which included pronunciation actually designed, like the headings were smaller or a different color, and just subliminally, as you're working through a course, you get the impression that this bit isn't important, I can skip that. So when you're putting different elements on your page, if they're equally important, they should look equally important and not look expendable, not look skippable. Just briefly, as I imagine that a number of you are also probably teacher trainers or supporting teachers, it's not just about what you do with language learners, it's also about how you support teachers to develop their pronunciation confidence and skills. And particularly in the case of course books and published materials, there's some research in this area. The research, unsurprisingly, finds that published course materials could be more supportive for teachers. I know that as a new teacher, I was very frustrated when I was teaching with a book that had an answer key, but no explanation of the answers. And I'd think, well, that doesn't actually really help me that much. It doesn't help me teach it. It helps me tell my students, you know, yes, no, correct, but it doesn't help me teach. It doesn't help me explain. So with that in mind, ideally, if you're writing teachers' material to develop pronunciation, you need to offer guidance in how to evaluate and how to assess students' pronunciation. Like, what are you listening for? What do you do with what they produce? How do you give feedback? How do you measure this or correct that? Well, correct being a relative term. It's also really important to clearly explain pronunciation features because a lot of teachers don't know. A lot of us have very limited training and interest and confidence in teaching pronunciation. And putting something on a page like, oh, this should be falling intonation. A lot of teachers don't know what that means and they're embarrassed to ask. So if you're in a position to write material for teaching teachers how to teach pronunciation or something like an answer key in a course book, include an explanation, include a little glossary of what this means. Like if you talk about a stressed syllable, what does it mean for a syllable to be stressed? Don't assume that the teacher knows. And also encourage recycling and revisiting. So just like I said, it's not enough to just teach something once. It's important to remind teachers of other points in the course that you might want to refer back to. So, oh, we did this in unit 2, remember? And, you know, like with all aspects of language, remind students of how this little thing fits in the bigger system of what you're teaching. Remind them if they've seen it before, if they've done it before, if they did really well with it before, you know, boost their confidence. Say, we're going to focus on this again. Remember last time? Remember the context? And so on. And again, it's useful in your material to remind teachers too, especially if you're teaching many classes at once and you might just forget that you've done this thing before with this group. So in order to do the tasks that we're about to do, we need to briefly revise what all of this means for ELF. So we talked a lot about pronunciation material and principles for making materials for pronunciation. Now, if you are doing this with an ELF perspective, you need priorities. And that means you need to know the answer to this question. So what is intelligible from an ELF perspective? What does it mean to be easily understood in international contexts? What does the research tell us? Now, the first thing I want to mention, because this is often picked up and critiqued, is that you'll see the date in that reference is 20 years ago now. There has been research since then. This particular research focused, actually didn't start by focusing on pronunciation. It started by just focusing on language classrooms and what caused breakdown. You know, when did communication break down and why? And the general finding, and I'm simplifying here because this is a whole book, and I recommend that you read it because it's a really interesting read. The general finding was that actually pronunciation was often the root of the problems. Now, since then, a lot of people have gone and investigated particular aspects of that research and come back to them and said, okay, well, let's not look at the whole world of communication breakdown. Let's look at this sound in this group of speakers and see what happens. You know, does communication break down if they use a different sound or so on? And generally speaking, that initial research has been corroborated every time. People are finding that actually this list of features was pretty accurate from the beginning. There are still some gray areas and people are still doing research. But yeah, I've found that almost everything I've read since then has agreed with this initial list. So don't be too thrown by the date. So this is our benchmark, is this lingua franca core. So this core of features of pronunciation, which are absolutely central, which are top priorities if you want to be understood in international settings. And then outside that core, there's room for a variety of other aspects of speech, which give you an accent, you know, and that's all right. Everybody has an accent. As long as you're paying attention to this core of high priority features, then it's very likely that you will be understandable to others in international settings. And there's just 4 things in this core. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but there's a link here where you can read more about it. And I'll just summarize now so that we can get to the hands-on creative bit. So thing number 1 is most consonant sounds. And just one vowel sound, and that's this like bird or girl. Other vowel sounds, doesn't matter so much if you say ah or eh. What's really important is that you're consistent. So don't mix up words that generally rhyme. You know, bad and sad should have the same vowel sound. But if you say it more like bed and said, which speakers in many places will, including some native speakers, doesn't really matter. The quality is not so important. This is the one vowel where the quality apparently is quite important. When people mix with other vowels, it can cause confusion. And I say most consonant sounds because those 2 favorites that all teachers adore, the th and the, are not supported by research as being critical for understanding in an ELF context. So if you need to focus your time on pronunciation in your course, probably don't need to focus on the, which is not to say that students don't need to understand them, but it's not a priority to produce them. They can substitute them with something that's easier, something like f and v. And again, the most important thing is just to be consistent. So don't sometimes do this, sometimes do that. That's what messes with the listener's expectations and gives that impression that you can't be understood. So just be consistent. Because an accent ultimately is a consistent way of speaking and making sounds. That's how we know, that's how we recognize accents. That's how you listen to someone and say, oh, they're Spanish, because they are consistently producing things in a particular way. You also need to preserve most consonant clusters. So at the beginning of words, it's really quite important. In the middle of words, it's generally quite important. At the end of words, there's ongoing research, but things like the word preservation, the p and the r together at the beginning of the word, it's quite important. Don't drop one of those sounds or add a sound. Same with that word there, clusters, the k and l. at the beginning of cluster. Don't drop one of the sounds, don't add an extra sound. So keep that group of consonant sounds together. The length of vowels is quite important. And this does not mean the length in the sort of received pronunciation sense, like ship and sheep, different lengths. What this means is how the sound following the vowel actually influences the length. And when you think about how vowels work, this kind of makes sense. In a lot of languages, I don't know about Portuguese, you'd have to tell me, but the word for vowel actually sounds like the word for voice or vocal or something like that. The idea when you make a vowel, you are consistently using your vocal folds. There's vibration there, which is producing noise. Now, if that is followed by a consonant, which also produces noise, then just in terms of time, like milliseconds, your ears and your brain are perceiving more noise. So the general impression is that the vowel is longer. So a word like bag, it sounds longer than a word like back, because the g keeps your voice switched on and the k doesn't. But the actual vowel, the a, is the same sound in both words. And this is something which I have never seen in a course book, never. And yet it's something that research suggests is quite influential to listeners. So there's a lot of surprises when you start digging into this field of study. And then finally, appropriate, and that's deliberately a vague word grouping and placement of nuclear stress. So where is the main stress in a group of words, not just an individual word? And again, when you think about it, this is quite intuitive, because wherever you put your main stress, that's where your listener's attention is drawn. So if I say, oh, are you going to Brazil this year? Say, no, I'm going next year. I've put the stress on next as a contrast. I'm drawing the listener's attention to that word. Now, in that case, it's an easy illustration because I'm using it for contrast. But actually, in everything we say, the main stress is landing on particular words that are kind of most important for the listener's attention. And that's it. Those are the things you need to prioritize if you're teaching pronunciation from an ELF context. Now, if your context is Brazilian Portuguese, you'll need to filter this against the needs of those speakers. So I'll just briefly summarize, what does this mean for speakers of Brazilian Portuguese? And again, remember, I'm happy to share these slides later, so don't worry if I know there's a lot of information. Certain things that may need attention. And again, I say may because every learner is different. Every mouth, every ear is different. So these are generalizations, but they're useful generalizations if you don't know where else to begin. So consonants, and especially aspiration of p, t, and k. So producing a little bit more air with those sounds, which is not as common in Brazilian Portuguese or in most varieties. Again, there's a lot of accents of Portuguese, so it's always difficult to generalize. But yeah, p, so pay instead of pay, a little bit more air. T and d, particularly depending on the sound that comes after them. So I have a friend whose name is Tiff, and when he goes to Brazil, he's called Chifi. So if your first language is Brazilian Portuguese, using the t and not being influenced to produce ch will be quite important, because those consonants have different meaningful values in English, and the same with d or j. So not conflating those sounds. Some contrasts in sounds, so like r and h, and again, depending where you're from in Brazil, because there's a wide variety of accents, and not everybody will say rock and roll. Some people will say rock and roll. But knowing what is important for your students and their background and what they're likely to have trouble with. And at the ends of words, and n. So recognizing that in their first language, learners might pronounce these sounds a little bit differently at the end of a word than at the beginning of a word. I will allow you to give me examples because you are far more fluent in Brazilian Portuguese than me. And this is one of the interesting things with ELF as well, is that you start to really get into little details and you realize that it's not the case that we just have to teach everything, cover it all. It's often really very specific. And this is where, again, a lot of older books, kind of pre-ELF, that tell you, oh, Brazilian speakers are fine with They have in Portuguese. Well, yeah, but it behaves differently. And that means if it's at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word, it could be problematic. And so by paying attention to these little details, you can make quite a difference to how clearly your students can communicate. And this is also where knowing your students' first language is a huge advantage. I had to learn all this through books and experience. And clusters, maybe. It depends who you read and who you ask. Certain clusters of sounds may or may not be difficult. So it's just important to be aware that it might need some support. And in terms of vowels, so that's just consonants. In terms of vowels, well, this one, the vowel, which to the best of my knowledge does not exist in Brazilian Portuguese, and the vowel length that I mentioned before. So the difference between, say, back and bag, or seat and seed. And things you don't have to worry about. So don't worry, which does not mean ignore, forget, never think about it, don't teach it for listening. It just means don't worry. Don't spend all your precious teaching hours doing this for your students' speech. These two, th and the, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. The dark L at the ends of words. So if your students introduce themselves and say they are from Brazil, fine, fine, no trouble. The schwa doesn't matter if they're producing other kind of short vowels instead. It's not a priority for being understood. If they want to sound British or American, then fine. But if you're looking from an ELF perspective, not a priority. And maybe word grouping and stress. Again, it depends who you ask about the rhythm patterns of Portuguese. Maybe the precise vowel quality, but again, the important thing is to be consistent. Don't worry about rising and falling intonation, not a priority. And the same for syllable timing. So the rhythm with which your students speak English, if they don't have the kind of syllable timed rhythm that we say Portuguese has or English has, not a priority. Now, I'm very conscious that I've been going for about 45 minutes, and I think maybe I'll give you the option of either doing this kind of little mini workshop where I'll give you some examples of pronunciation activities on a page and ask you to improve them based on all the principles we've talked about and what you read. And then we can use time after that for questions and answers. Or if you're not so interested in writing materials, you just want to talk about the principles and you'd rather do Q&A now, that's fine by me. Let me know what you prefer. Maybe you want to take a minute and do a little vote or a discussion and I can just wait. Because there's a lot of information there. I know there's a lot to take in.
Well, Laura, I think you decide. We are here to listen to you. So I don't know about the others, but I'm fine. I'm fine with how things are moving. So what I don't know what
does everybody think? I mean, you tell me more about your interest. If none of you are really interested in writing pronunciation materials except in a general academic way, then we don't need to do a practical exercise of writing them. But if some of you are thinking, actually, I make worksheets all the time for my class, or I want to move into publishing, then maybe it would be quite useful to do this now. So anybody want to write in the chat or turn on your microphone and just volunteer a thought? I'm open to suggestions.
Anybody?
I can do that teacher thing where I can nominate you if you don't volunteer.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe I should ask more specifically, is anybody focusing particularly on materials, writing materials or evaluating materials for language learning?
Well, not as specifically, but I think, for example, a lot of teachers, so they have to readapt or create their own materials depending on the situation. So if they are, for example, more ELF aware, so they have to adapt. If you could give some insights on that, not, you know, to write materials, let's say more commercial, but then within the everyday routine, you know, teachers usually have to do that. So they have to, you know, I think ideas or insights on how to make your materials, you know, maybe ELF aware or ELF oriented. I think that would be interesting.
Okay, well then I think the first activity would be useful. So we're going to rewrite some rubrics, basically, because this is something that I find particularly in terms of ELF awareness and being ELF aware. Often the obvious bits are easy to fix. You can just say, okay, I've just crossed the off my syllabus.
Right.
But there's a lot of like subtle behaviors that teachers do, and I mean, I include myself, that we're not even aware we're doing, where things like, you know, we say this, where it never occurs to you that that's problematic until you start to realize that's very exclusive. You know, we say this, but you do that. When are the students going to join the we group? When are they going to be in the you know, the privileged inner circle? So I think let's do at least the first exercise in the workshop. We'll do a bit of rubric rewriting. So what I'll do, I will show you how this looks.
Yeah, because we have a couple of, we have good comments and questions already, especially on the channel, and I think would be nice for us to reflect over.
Super.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll meet you halfway. We'll do one of the practical activities.
Okay.
So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you 3 rubrics, 3 activity instructional sections that you might see in a course book. And in the first column, you'll have the originals, and then in the second column, I want you to rewrite them.
Right.
Now, I'll give you a little bit of time to try this by yourself. So there will be a couple moments where I don't say anything. So if you want to, you know, sing or play guitar or something, make sure people know we're still live. Be my guest. But I won't talk. I'll just let you think. And these are things that I want you to remember, these principles on the screen now. So try to avoid phrasing, which is very kind of possessive or prescriptive. Try to keep it really clear, really short, really graded. I haven't got a specific level for these, but just if in doubt, grade it down. I think it should be simple. And clarify as far as possible if it's receptive or productive. So think about these things. These principles were also in the chapter, and they come back again and again in the book. So I'll put the original rubrics on the screen, and then I'm going to mute myself and let you think for, well, let's say 3 minutes. I'll give you a minute per rubric. And you can put your ideas in the chat or write them on a paper, or just keep them in your head, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Okay, everybody? Thank you. I can see some thumbs up. So here they are, and I'll mute myself for 3 minutes.
Okay, are we supposed to make comments?
Whatever you prefer. If you'd like to put comments in the chat and compare your ideas,
just
fine.
Rewrite.
In a moment, I'll show you how I've suggested rewriting them.
All right.
You've still got a minute by my count. You've got 1 minute.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay, just to give you time. But don't feel obliged to share if you're not sure. Share if you want to. Don't feel like you have to. All right, that's your 3 minutes up. Before I reveal my suggestions, thank you, Daniel, it's hard. I'd end up increasing the sentences. Yeah, it is hard. It's really hard. And I think, again, this is something I only learned from working in a publisher for several years. I was like, it's actually a lot harder than you think to write good instructions for a task. And there isn't necessarily one right way. These are just suggestions, and there's a lot more detail in the book. And this is why we were asked to write this book, is to kind of walk people through the process of how to write activities. So thank you for being so honest and acknowledging that it is difficult. It really makes you think. And I just want to reiterate what I said, which is part of the problem with, or part of the challenge of taking a kind of ELF-aware approach, is that it's so deeply embedded to refer to this kind of mythical group of perfect, idealized users of English, and how the learners are not in that group, that we do things all the time, like, you know, we say this, or native speakers do that, or, you know, it doesn't sound natural. You know, people often think, oh, I don't want to say correct, so I'll say natural. But what does natural mean? It's just
I would eliminate.
Native-like.
Yes, thinking about this, I would eliminate a lot of words there. And the natural is one of them. Clearly, is one of them.
Yeah. Clearly, I don't have too much trouble with, as long as you recognize who you're talking about, like clear to whom. Whose ears are we thinking? But natural is a particular word that I don't like. So let's have a look and see.
Okay.
So here's the first one. So again, these are just suggestions. There are other ways that would be good too, but you'll see that the principle here is clarifying that this is not about what you should say. It's about listening. We're focusing on developing your awareness of pronunciation, which is not necessarily the same as producing something. There's also a direct question, so grading it for lower level learners. Even elementary classes could probably understand who says more clearly. Here's the next one. So you can see the changes are quite subtle. We're not saying anymore in this new version, you know, we say with a closed mouth. Well, who is we? It's simply telling them what to do, just a clear, an actual instruction, not an implied, you know, it would be better if you were in this group and you did it this way, but just say this, do this. And then you are the judge. So does your partner say M clearly is more about that learner being the judge of clarity, instead of do they sound natural? Well, natural to who? Who am I supposed to be? Whose role am I playing here? What listener am I pretending to be? It's more just, what do you think? You know, did you understand it? Was it clear to you? End of. That's the end.
What if you, sorry for interrupting. What if we changed clearly for intelligibly?
No, what
Does
does
it
everyone
make
else
any
think?
difference? What do you think?
I think it's a good idea, but if you think of
Because
creating
when we say
material to
clearly, I
students,
understand. Sorry, Danielle, go ahead.
maybe intelligibility to students, to ELT students, might not be that clear, right? What do you think?
Because when you say, yes, Danielle, when you say clearly, of course I understand, Laura, but clearly to whom and based on what? So anyway, so if we think about intelligibility, so I think it's, I don't like the word neutral, but anyway, it's less, well, in my opinion, of course, you are the expert, but what do you think?
Well, no, I mean, I think every teacher is the expert for their own students. And I think that dialogue is really important. And I suppose I should clarify here that I'm talking about instructions which live on a page and have no teacher explanation. If you were in the classroom with your students, absolutely have a conversation with them about, you know, who is the listener, clear to whom. That's a really important question.
Right.
The reason this was rephrased here as clearly and not intelligibly was just for that second tip, is keep it graded to the appropriate level. So with a lot of my students, we would have to talk first about intelligibility. What does that mean? That word itself has, you know, a million syllables. We're getting into linguistics. So it depends on the student. I opted for clearly on the assumption that they could look that up in a dictionary and find and understand what I'm trying to get them. Lucielle, and you look like you want to say something.
Yeah. Actually, in the chat here in YouTube, there's a suggestion from Juliana, and she's saying that maybe use easy. Is it easy to understand instead of clear? Would be a better option.
That is a good suggestion. I like that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Juliana.
And also, there's also a suggestion from Clarissa. She said that she came up with an idea for the first activity of rewriting. And she said, you are going to hear two people talking, check in the books when you understand what they are trying to say and explain it with your own words. So this is her suggestion for rewriting it.
Yeah, so the difficulty here is that, of course, this is a very limited practice task we're doing, and there's no context. So what's in my mind here is an activity where they're simply listening to the pronunciation of like a word, one word. So there's nothing to rephrase. I think if they were listening to a dialogue, like you know, the full conversation and not just focusing on one sound, then maybe, yeah, because yes, that would demonstrate that you understood their message, you know, going back to our definition of intelligibility. I think, yes, that actually reveals a weakness in my slide. So thank you, Clarissa. I'll give more context next time I do this activity. So yeah, here, if we're just looking at pronunciation and we're looking at one sound, I think you can simplify the task and the instructions.
Yeah, okay.
I hope that answers your question. And here's the last one. So again, this is a suggestion. Others are welcome. What's important to me here is that we're all agreed on the sort of process. Like, what is it that we're trying to remove or reduce, which is a focus on sounding native-like, sounding natural, whatever that means. You know, making instructions for pronunciation activities so long and confusing that teachers and students just don't want to do them because they weren't confident in the first place. So these are the principles, are, you know, keeping it simple, keeping it clear, making it clear if it's listening or speaking, and avoiding that implicit assumption that the goal is to sound like this anonymous native speaker. I feel so promotional saying this, but the truth is that there's a lot more in the book. There's more examples, there's more worked examples, there's an answer key, there's an explanation for everything, because this is something that a lot of teachers don't have training in. I mean, even a lot of materials writers don't have training in writing materials. They're just good at it. They've developed their own skills. So what we really wanted to do was make something very practical that would help teachers and writers and people who do both present things in a way that is more accessible internationally and has different priorities, is not so focused on native English, whatever that is, which, there's plenty of material for that already. And for some learners, that'll be appropriate, and that's fine, but that's their, that already exists. I think, so the next activity is a bit kind of longer. It's better for sort of discussion. So maybe what I'll do is just, and there isn't a specific answer key, it's really a discursive task. So Salvio, maybe when I can send you my slides after, and then if you want to distribute them to your group, and then you can decide if you want to discuss more together. And that means, I'll just skip that. One last thing, just to show you where to get this book I keep waving at you. It was originally published as an ebook. So if you prefer to read it digitally as a PDF or on a Kindle or something like that, you can. That's why it says 2018/19. So 2018 was the digital version. And then 2019, it came out in paper. So you can buy it in paper if you prefer that as well.
Right.
And this is the website that I mentioned before that Katie Simpson and I put together years ago, which unfortunately we don't maintain now because we have a lot of other projects and there's already quite a lot there. There's loads of resources, worksheets, there's research theory as well as practice, there's videos, there's training, there's plenty there. So if you want to know more and you want more specific ideas to take into your classroom, go and have a look. And then all that remains is for me to say thank you for having me, for hosting me. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you giving up so much time on your Friday morning or afternoon if you're somewhere else in the world. There's 3 slides of references here for you, which you can read whenever you want and further reading. And I think maybe I just need to grab a cup of coffee.
Yes, go ahead.
Questions.
we wait. That's when we take time to collect the questions on the channel. But thank you, Laura.
Ah, great. Oh, well, you should have a break too. You need to stretch your legs. Everybody stand
we'll be here.
up and
well,
stretch.
I have my water here, so I'm fine. But anyway, go get your coffee, and then. But anyway, thanks a lot.
I'll be just one moment.
Yeah.
I'll turn off my camera and microphone while I'm gone, but I'm still here.
Okay, good. So while Laura is grabbing her coffee, anybody would like to make comments or say something, and then I don't know, Lucielle can already have a look at the questions we have on the channel. Of course, we could explore lots of things here. So this is a very interesting topic, and I think it involves the practicalities of teaching. And of course, depending on our view, we can say, well, is pronunciation a big issue or not a big issue in ELF teaching? So, but I think there are interesting questions there on the channel. Anybody would like to make any comments while we wait for Laura?
Lu, maybe you could read the comments.
Yeah, there are like some comments over there in YouTube channel that actually they are not, we could go through some comments, but not actually questions. When Laura comes back, then we go through and then we can address her the questions. So we'll like, we can read the comments and then, post our own comments on this, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the comments.
Sorry, Lou, the comments would be interesting for her to listen to and make comments in the.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, go ahead.
Okay, then Thelma, one of the first comments is like, she says about one of the things that Laura commented about Glasgow.
Yeah, the
Glasgow
example
speakers,
she
right?
gave.
And she says that it's interesting to unpack the idea that native-like accent, Crystal, is not about accents of native speakers, but of a particular accent. The example of Glasgow exemplifies that.
Yeah.
It seems that, and then she continues, it seems that accents are framed more as assumptions about personal traits than about intelligibility.
Intelligibility. Yeah. This is a good comment for Laura to reply or to make another comment over that.
Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else?
Arnaud also says one comment over there, and he says that the communicative method contributes a lot to a monolingual vision, and he comments that on a context in which she was talking about the idea of real speaking or getting real speakers on to our classroom so that expose our students to real speakers. And then he said, the communicative method contributes a lot to a monolingual vision. That's his comment.
Okay.
Let me see what else we have over there.
Well, Laura is back.
I'm back and caffeinated.
Oh, good. Laura, can you stop sharing, please, so then we can see you better?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, of course. Go on.
Yeah. Okay, we already we are just collecting a few comments, and then, as I said, we still have around half an hour. So great. I'm going to. I think who has a question? Danielle, was that Danielle?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, Danielle, make a question. I have also one. I had lots of questions, but then I don't want to be selfish, so I want.
All right, we'll go alphabetically. So Danielle, you're first.
Yes. So Danielle, go ahead.
First of all, Laura, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. You're welcome.
And our friend Julia, she wrote on YouTube that today the session was interesting, was very interesting. And we know that pronunciation is important for intelligibility, but speaking for myself, I feel unsure of how and if to approach it. And she's a native English speaker, and I'm a native Portuguese speaker, and I have taught Portuguese to non-native Portuguese speakers before, and this is a question that I had, right? Should I teach my pronunciation the way I speak? Would that be good for my students? So what should I teach? And from your presentation, I understood that to teach pronunciation, we need in a lingua franca perspective, we need empirical data, right? We need empirical data on what represents an obstacle to intelligibility and what doesn't. So is that it? Did I understand correctly? But if that's it, if that's the point, do you think empirical data can encompass enough different Englishes to a point that we should create a standard way to teach it? Did you understand my question? It's
wow. Yeah, I understood all your questions. There's about 5 questions in there, and they're really good ones.
Yeah,
they're really hard.
No,
don't apologize. Like, this is why this topic is so interesting, is it just generates so many, you know, you realize how interconnected everything is, because you start thinking about one thing and then it sparks another thing, and then you realize this depends on that and this influences that, and it's, so let me try to respond as best I can. For me, one of the best things about taking an approach which is based on the lingua franca core, or at least a kind of short list of priorities, is that you can select from it what is appropriate for your students. So it's not about teaching a particular variety or a particular accent. You're not even teaching, you know, you're not saying, I am teaching my students to speak English with a Brazilian accent. You're simply saying, I'm teaching my students how to be self-aware enough that they can modify the way they speak to be understood by a wide variety of people, and that if they have any difficulty, they have strategies for getting around this because they know what is probably causing the difficulty. And this is one of the reasons why pronunciation should always be integrated with other skills, is that most of the time we are not relying simply on sound. We have context, there's vocabulary, there's all these other things happening. So that's kind of part of the response, is that it's, when you think about like, what should I be teaching? I think that the critical thing to remember is that we're teaching features. We're not teaching a model. We're teaching a kind of how, not a what. If I try to think of an analogy, like, you know, let's say you're teaching writing, and I mean teaching people how to write, literacy, like children. You teach them the alphabet, but they're not going to write with your handwriting, because they don't have your hand, they don't have your muscles, they don't have your body, they don't have your pressure that you put on the pen, they don't have your, you know, you've had too much coffee and your hand's shaking. But you're teaching them letters, which are more or less consistent, and anybody who reads that alphabet can read the words they wrote down. So by analogy with pronunciation and from an ELF perspective and thinking of the lingua franca core, you're teaching the letters, you're not teaching the handwriting. They're not going to produce exactly what you produce when you use those letters. Just like with speech, they're not going to produce exactly what you produce when you use certain sounds or certain features or certain stress patterns. But you're teaching them what is the kind of general shape of this thing. Here's how you make it. Here's how you produce it. Let's try it. Listen to them. Did you understand? You know, why not? And it's much more about like finding your way through that system. And I suppose I should use my nuclear stress here, finding your way through that system. It's not about saying like, you must say this because this is ELF. And this is one of the reasons actually why personally, I really resist the phrasing of teaching ELF, because that just sounds like a variety to me. And using English in such a dynamic way can't be codified into one variety that everybody agrees on. That's kind of the point. Like the point is that everybody is all doing different things and we need to be flexible, and there are some things that we need to agree on, but actually there's a lot of room for difference. And I mean, if you think about it, even if we teach our students certain features of the lingua franca core and we help them practice, they'll go out into the world and speak with people who didn't have that instruction and don't follow those rules. And so really, it's about opening our students' minds and teaching them how pronunciation works in general and how that interacts with other language systems. And when you think about it that way, it can be quite scary and like, you know, where do I even begin? But also I think it's quite liberating, because it doesn't matter how you sound. It doesn't matter what your first language is. That's not the point. The point is that we're all able to use English in this way by following certain kind of unwritten rules. What we're doing as teachers is just trying to write the rules down so that our students, you know, because they're not linguists. Like we hang out on a Friday morning chatting for a couple hours about pronunciation and ELF. They don't do that. They've got loads of stuff happening in their life. They just want to get on with using English. So we're just trying to make it manageable to them. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but it was a hard question to answer.
It was a hard question to make too, but thank you. Wonderful answer. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So who's next? And then I'll go after this next. It's Juliana. Juliana is here.
Hi,
Laura.
Juliana. I know, I've been dying to wave at you. Hi, Juliana. Long time no see. How are you?
I'm good. Currently on complete lockdown here in London.
Ooh, London. You're in London.
Yeah.
Yeah,
she's been my PhD here. Yeah, with Alessia.
Ah, fantastic. How did I not know that? I'm sorry.
No,
well,
that's
nice to
fine.
see you again.
You really don't need to know that. Okay.
Well, I'm kind of out of the circles of the research network at the moment. I'm not so, because I don't work in an institution. And this is another, actually, just to mention that quickly, this is another challenge with following kind of ELF and developments in research, is that if you're not based in an institution, getting access to the latest research is a nightmare. When I say I don't have an affiliation, I work for myself, people don't know what to do with that. You know, it's really hard to just download a PDF of this article about intelligibility. I have to write to a friend who works in the university and can I read it? You know, so that actually is one of the reasons why I think things like this, like where we all get together and talk, are so important. Yeah. Because I've been to so many academic conferences where researchers kind of lament that their research isn't finding its way to classrooms. And then I've been to so many teachers' conferences where the teachers are like, well, their research is not relevant. I'm like, you need to talk to each other. Like, you got to share, you know, have a dialogue. Why are you doing this research if it's not to put it into classrooms? And why are you teaching if it's not to learn more about language and so on? So anyway, I say, you know, flippantly that I'm not in that world anymore, but it makes it hard to keep up with these things and to know if, you know, like Danielle, you were saying about like what research do I have to find evidence for this? It's hard to keep up with what people are finding and learning, and it moves really fast. You know, all of a sudden, Jennifer Jenkins' book is 20 years old. Like, when did that happen? When did that happen? What were we doing 20 years ago? You know, it's crazy. So anyway, I digress. Did you have a question, Juliana?
Yeah.
It's the coffee.
Because you were talking about the technicalities of intelligibility, which I'm very fond of. I did my MA on intelligibility, but focusing on the attitude of people, Brazilians in this case, towards different accents of English, and no, that was my undergrad work, and then my MA was 6 different countries, people reacting to Brazilian English and talking about intelligibility and stuff. My question is more about attitude. Like, do you tackle attitude when you're teaching pronunciation? Because I have experienced here situations, not so often because my English is quite standardized-ish, but once, not like long ago, a few months ago, an English woman who I'm acquainted with, it wasn't just a random person, she kind of stopped me because and corrected me because I didn't say Cambridge the way that she expected me to. I was gonna say the right way, but the right way to her. And then I'm like, I took a deep breath and I'm like, did you understand me when I said it the way I said it? And she's like, yeah, and but this is not how you say it. I'm like, this is how I say it. Anyway, so I was like, I understand, and I guess, well, I know she wanted to help, but then we went into a conversation about how they expect people to try to speak like native speakers. And then she explained that she studied French and Italian, and when she traveled to those places,
I was waiting for that. I was waiting for that comparison.
She said that she asks people to correct her because she wants to sound like them. But I explained English is a whole different thing because it's a world language. It's a global language. And international communication, you guys are the least intelligible ones. The research shows that. So I didn't say it like that, but like in the end, but you're not my target. So what do you say? Because in the real world, that's what our students are going to find, right? People that don't really quite get it, like that we are not trying to imitate them. And they are going to, in a way, react like, oh, you have an accent. Not cool. What do you think?
I mean, so much of what you've said is really familiar. And it's easy to laugh when, you know, we're among like-minded scholars, and we've all been there. I mean, I've been there. This is the thing, like I feel like pronunciation and accent is one of the last areas where overt discrimination and commentary is still quite acceptable. And I don't have a great deal of research background in that area, so I don't want to comment on things I don't really know about, but just intuitively, anecdotally, in my own experience, and living in London and in Britain for most of my life, you do come across these attitudes, and I think they're so much bigger than language. I mean, in the way that there will always be people in the world, you know, we're all different, and some people feel the need to comment on those differences. And I think and I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think we all do it. It's just that there are certain areas where it's acceptable and certain where it's not. I mean, in Britain, certainly nowadays in kind of mainstream culture, you'd never in a million years comment on how the color of someone's skin was different from yours, but it's still okay to correct how they said a word. And even if English is also their first language and they're from 5 miles away, it's one of those things that's just so embedded in, you know, there's so many accents. Who was it? Was it George Bernard Shaw said it's impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making another one detest him, or something like that. You know, there's so much attitude and bias bound up in speech. And I've also had those experiences that you had, Juliana, and you know, English is my first language, and in an ELT world, that affords me certain privilege, which I don't ask for or like to accept. But when I'm in Britain, I will always get comments, not always from strangers and not always kind, on how I said something. And then my feeling is like you just said, you know, like, well, that's how I say it. You know, did you understand me? Like, why are we wasting time on this?
Yeah.
There's a global pandemic. Priorities, people. But, you know, like, it's just,
but yeah,
it's really hard to know how to respond to that. When I teach pronunciation, so to come to your core question, yes, I deal with attitude to an extent, because so much of it to me seems to run so deep in our psychological security, and the way that we're socialized. And I'm using that word we again, but I really mean we as like the human race now, because all of us, bar a couple of terrible exceptions, go through a process of socialization. And, you know, as individuals, we develop a kind of psychological stance. We may be more or less secure, more or less controlling. And it's really hard, I find, to get into discussion in a classroom unless you have a very safe psychological environment where it's perfectly okay to discuss how you feel about things, to acknowledge your prejudices, your biases, to reflect on them, to develop. I don't think you can have any intelligent conversation about accent and identity without talking about attitudes and treatment and the impact of sounding a certain way. I just don't think it's possible. So I do deal with it, but the way that I deal with it varies a lot on the class and what they seem prepared to discuss. And if I were in a context, so the other thing is that I teach almost always in multilingual settings, and it can be difficult enough to have a conversation like this in your first language than if you're like a pre-intermediate student trying to talk about it in English at the beginning of a course with a bunch of people you don't know very well. If, however, you were with a group of students for like a year, you might have this discussion in their first language if you're able to, because what you're talking about is the ideas and the ideology, not so much even the specific sounds or accent. So yeah, my feeling is it needs to be dealt with, but the teacher is best placed to know how sensitive to be and what's acceptable and when to stop the conversation and so on. You know, it's really hard and it's very personal.
Can I compliment something, Laura, based on one of your slides? Well, this is the real life. And of course, what happens in the real life usually, well, in this concern, I think it happens also in the classroom. So that's why I think in terms of these meta-linguistic features, we need really a revolution, not only in evolution as you mean, you see? So both in this whole sense and also in the practicality. So that's why, you know, when I saw your slide, I think it makes sense, but in a way we do need a revolution because this is very strong. It's impregnated in people's mentalities and in attitudes too.
I think you're right. Maybe in future I'll turn that into a question: revolution or evolution. I think because in terms of, you know, like, so we're talking about materials today, and I think people often really panic at this ideological issue and are like, oh my God, I can never use a gap fill or whatever. Like, no. We're not saying, you know, it's not, you don't have to change everything you've ever done in your class. In that sense, it's just an evolution of thinking. But you're probably right that some of this is quite revolutionary.
Well, at least we need to think about it.
Yes, and talk about it, and like I say, have a space where it's safe to talk about it. Let our students know that it's okay to reflect and share, and that we're all learning, and that takes a certain kind of politics of the classroom that is something we rarely stop to think about.
Absolutely. Yes, Lou, go ahead.
I'm following some questions in chat, and I can see there's a bit of overlap in questions. And also, when you type K's, is that laughing?
Yeah.
Thank you. I see. I'm getting little cultural insights out of this as well.
is like laugh, laugh, laugh.
Ah.
Yeah, KKK is KKK. So it's...
Thank you. Obrigada. Now I learned something.
Yes, Luciele has a question or a comment from the channel.
Yeah,
Great.
I do. Just let me get it over here. So I was talking before about Thelma's comments. She makes some comments and then she goes on to pose a question. She said that it is interesting to unpack the idea that native accent, as in Crystal, is not about accents of native speakers, but of a particular kind of accent. Your example of Glasgow exemplifies that. And then it says it seems that accents are framed more as assumptions about personal traits than about intelligibility.
Absolutely.
And then she poses a question: should ELF emphasize more than the other factors involved in different accents than just intelligibility?
Well, should is a big word. I think, well, I know, I mean, when you start reading all the various, literature and publications about this, things besides accent are included and emphasized, definitely. I mean, we could talk about this for days, and I had 40 minutes and I couldn't even keep to 40 minutes. So I'm just focusing on intelligibility. But yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I used to say, and I'll say again now, because I still really believe it, but this has come up a lot in, excuse me, that's my phone. This has come up a lot in teacher training courses in the past, is, do people actually want a particular accent, or do they want the prestige which is associated with that accent? And I think if you ask the right questions, you get the right answers, like you get to the point. And that is profoundly uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of us to realize the cognitive dissonance involved, where, a lot of people would say, no, I don't need prestige. I don't want to be important. This, it's okay to be unpopular. I'm just me or whatever. And then, but I also really, really, really want to speak in a way that's acceptable to the majority, powerful. It's power. It comes down to power. There's power dynamics at play with accents. And that's also why, like, quite early on, I try to divorce accent from intelligibility. There's different things. There are huge groups of people who all speak with, let's say, the same accent, in that it's identifiable where they're from or where they were educated, but some are more intelligible and some aren't. So this is also why when I teach pronunciation, generally, for me, the courses that I choose to be involved with, we focus on intelligibility. I'm not there to teach them accent. There are people out there who can do that and do it really well, and they do it for things like actors and movies, and there's a place for that. But I'm not teaching actors, I'm not teaching spies. They are perfectly welcome to keep their accent and identify where they're from. But yeah, there are definitely other factors associated with accent, definitely. And a lot of other ELF scholars and teachers, as I'm sure you guys know, would deal with those areas more. I just find it quite interesting how sound works. That was my area of interest. But there's loads more to be explored, definitely.
Okay. I think Eliane has a question, right?
There's somebody called Eliane in chat saying, no, that's okay. I've already answered them. But
Eliane?
I'm happy to take a question.
Eliane, will you?
Eliane, your microphone.
Question, yeah, you said like you wanted to pose a question.
Yes, I think she had a question, but the question was already answered.
No.
So she
Yeah. As Gabriela too. Yeah. But I have a question from Kelly, who is part of the group, and she's participating in the YouTube today because she had problems and she couldn't remain in the Zoom. And then she posed a question over there in the YouTube, and she says, I believed that it would not be possible to approach pronunciation within the context of lingua franca. Wouldn't it be? And then she asks, wouldn't it be prescriptive in an attempt to put ELF in a standard? And then she goes on, bringing the topic on pronunciation wouldn't go against the character and non-native status of ILF, English as a lingua franca, of ELF actually.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, unless it's that, you know, if we prescribe anything, isn't that a negative thing, whether it's ELF or anything else? To which my response would be, in order for language to function on any level, there has to be some agreement of meaning. We have to find common ground. Or, you know, it's not a case that anything goes. Absolutely not a case that anything goes. You know, if we really want to communicate with other people, it's cooperative, it's collaborative, and that means some sort of agreement, whether conscious or not, that this sound represents this, or this you know, string of sounds represents this word, which refers to that thing. I mean, we're getting into sort of semiotics here in the philosophy of, you know, the what's it called, the sign. Oh, de Saussure is in my head. What was this thing? There's something of the sign. But this idea, you know, thank you. This I say this is a chair, you say it's a chair, we agree, it's both, you know.
Yeah.
And pronunciation is the same. There's got to be some, thank you, arbitrariness of the sign. That's the word.
Yeah.
But yeah, so, and I mean, okay, so that's semiotics, but there's an element of that in speech too, which is that I recognize that the string of sounds you just produced map to a string of sounds in my mental lexicon which have this meaning. So I don't think we can say anything goes. We have to prescribe something. But then the word prescription is maybe too strong for that. I mean, that is just agreement and teaching. And that's, again, one of the things I like about the lingua franca core is what it does is it distills all of the possible features of pronunciation into one very short subsection where we say, outside of this, there's loads of room for personal identity and so on. But, you know, we have a bare minimum of agreed, intelligible characteristics, and this is what they are. So I don't think prescription in itself is wholly negative. I don't think we can ever, I mean, what would we teach if we said that anything was possible? But I think I understand where the question is coming from, and this idea that, you know, how is prescribing this any better from prescribing that?
Yeah,
to which I would say,
about a variety, right?
Exactly. So to which I would say that ELF is not a variety, it's a way of using English, which this body of research suggests will be most effective if you do these things. But that does not mean that by doing those things, you are trying to claim membership of a group that has a lot of power and prestige, and like that is your underlying motivation. So the motivations are different, the power is different, you know, the power lies in the hands of the two people trying to communicate with each other in that moment of interaction, rather than in some anonymous group somewhere where, you know, power is vested historically. And in that sense, I do personally disagree with prescribing that. I certainly think if any student wants to pursue their English in that way, it should be their choice, and it should be an informed choice. And that's another one of the issues around this topic, which is that how often do the students have enough information to make that choice? You know, they don't know. They are not linguists. They don't spend mornings sitting around talking about ELF and pronunciation and drinking coffee. And, you know, that's not their world. And so how can we expect them to make an informed choice if we don't give them the information and don't involve them in the dialogue and don't have a discussion about these issues? If we do all of that and they still say, I just really like the way this sounds and that's the way I want to use English. Well, okay. But often they're sort of forced into that because we've told them as an industry, we've told them that's what you need. That's what will make you acceptable and understandable. And acceptable and understandable are different things. So, yeah.
Can I again complement this discussion? I want to mention something about the lingua franca core. And of course, as you said, the lingua franca core has been here for 20 years and not without criticism, and especially after the developments of ELF. And of course, because, you know, it has its limitations. So then, and of course, I understand you, and I read the section of the book that you sent to us, and of course, you mentioned the lingua franca core as a reference, but again, I was looking at this one of the chapters of the lingua franca handbook by Gardner and Turding. which is pronunciation and miscommunication in ELF interactions. And they conducted a very interesting research with speakers in Southeast Asia, basically, Chinese, Japanese. And one thing that they concentrated on was exactly the clusters. So then, what do we do then? For example, because for when you just mentioned, for example, that the given consonant clusters are important, but then a work like this basically comes up with features in consonant clusters that are basically they are eliminated. For example, they bring examples like the word I think it's practice becomes practice. So for this whole, let's say, of course, it's this this community of speakers. So what do you think? Don't you think the lingua franca core, in many ways, has, well, of course, it has its value, but how comprehensive has become? What type of, for example, of let's say, reorganization should we, especially teachers, try to engage in order to really, consider the different communities where ELF is spoken. So what do you think?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because I think this reveals, and I'm not saying you are the one leveling this criticism, but I think this reveals how often English as a lingua franca and something like the LFC is subject to criticisms that we would never level at other aspects of teaching. If we pick up a course book and look at the list of typical grammar features for a particular level, and the course book hasn't been designed specifically for Southeast Asia or Brazil or whatever, nobody ever goes, oh, who created this traditional grammar syllabus? Don't they know that my students in Brazil have different issues with the present perfect than your guys in Thailand? What am I supposed to do? Now I have to adapt this for my context. Well, of course you do, because that's how teaching works and every learner is different. So again, I don't say that this is you specifically leveling this criticism, but I think ELF is it cuts so close to the bone, to use this idiom of it. People are so attached to the sociological and psychological significance of accent and identity and power and prestige, that to suggest that they take a kind of framework and adapt it and focus and select for their context suddenly becomes offensive and impossible to them in a way that never happens with something like a vocabulary list. Nobody ever goes, why have you only put these 200 words in this book? There's 10,000 in the dictionary. What am I supposed to do? Why have you suggesting such an absurd approach to teaching vocabulary? And equally, it doesn't happen with more traditional pronunciation approaches. Nobody ever picks up a book and says, why does this book mention rising and falling intonation and the upper intermediate one doesn't? It's like what people are objecting to is the symptom, not the disease. Because actually we're trying to kind of treat that's a really strong word, maybe that's too strong. But I think it's very revealing that it's often people's immediate reaction is like, this is so unreasonable, this approach. This requires so much work from me. This requires so much adaptation to my context. But why does that objection never arise for a grammar syllabus? Or, do you know what I mean? And I just find that really interesting. And I think it really says a lot about how we perceive the use of English and something like accent and something like pronunciation. It's very personal, and people's reactions are often correspondingly personal. And that I find frustrating, I think, because then you find yourself just having the same, hitting the same ideological brick walls when you try to just do something different in your classroom. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I mean, this idea that this particular chapter focuses on
I do understand this reaction, Laura. I do understand, because ELF comes up as a reaction to the traditional, as you mentioned, remember? So then, and then it has this whole ambiguity that we are, in a way, replacing one prescription with another. That's the point.
Right, which is
Even
maybe what the
though
previous.
we understand there is, as you said, there is a space, there is room for a lot of flexibility, but that's the feeling. So, and then we know that it was restricted to a group of people but anyway, it's still, and we have Robin's book based on the lingua franca core, and a lot of people still take that as a reference. I understand that reaction because as we take ELF as something, you know, more than that or bigger than that, or as ELF as an attitude. So it's understandable.
It is understandable, and I think and I mean, I think frustration to a degree is understandable too. And I think this is just part of the nature of working in education, though, isn't it? Is, you know, what is it that we're conveying to a group of people who have consulted us for our expertise? You know, what is it that we're communicating to them as right and wrong, either implicitly or explicitly? Who holds all the power, and how is that manifested in the syllabus we construct and in the feedback that learners get? And by feedback, I mean, like, generally out in the street, you know, pronouncing Cambridge differently or whatever. This kind of, how does this actually turn up in our everyday lives and in our classrooms? What is it that we're preparing them for? And I think the issues here are so huge that, for me, always being very practically minded, I like to have these discussions and unpick the issues. But in the meantime, I've got a class to teach. And I don't want to carry on teaching this previous syllabus. So if I'm going to, let's say, prescribe anything, yes, it's problematic to replace one prescription with another, but I think that's not necessarily what the lingua franca core is trying to do, or at least the prescription is intended to be based in reality and not in power structures that are
it's much more realistic.
And I think it's also worth mentioning, and one of the reasons that I said earlier, like, go and read that 2000 book, the whole book, like, read the whole book. Nobody ever does. I know that we don't have time, and doing masters and PhDs, and we pick a chapter and whatever, but
I do have the book.
Good for you. Have you read it all? Chapter cover to cover?
Not a long time ago. I may not remember everything.
No, I'm being facetious, but I mean, like, I remember before I learned how to read academically, reading that book cover to cover, thinking, oh, this is how I need to. And the funny thing is that often now, if I sit in talks and I listen to people discussing ideas, often their objections arise, which were addressed in the original book. This poor author is never given credit for having anticipated and said quite openly, like, this is preliminary research, please take it and develop it. Like, you know, so so there's a lot of ideology that needs unpicking, and it is problematic, and it is locally variable, and that's part of the challenge of teaching this way. We're sort of assuming as well, like, through a lot of our discussion, that there's a kind of static or stable community of ELF users, and if we can just figure out what it is they're doing, we can teach it. But I know that there's research out there as well about transient communities of practice, and this idea that any given interaction is only, you know, you can only ever speak to that moment of interaction, because those same speakers in a different context or with another speaker would do different things. And this is so far beyond so much of our typical teacher training globally.
And in 20 years, things have changed a lot, right? So then we now have translanguage, interculturality, super diversity, and so many things.
Oh my gosh, and meanwhile, you know, your novice teachers are going, wait, how does the gap fill? Do they need 10 minutes for this? You know, and we're expecting them to unpack all of their cultural associations and ideological baggage. So
I think we have to take into consideration all. That's why we you know, it's fascinating to be discussing different points of view, because we have the ideological, the political, but we can't forget also the pedagogical, right? So then in the practicalities. So as you said, we have a class to teach, and that's the questions that many teachers ask us. So then what do I do in the classroom? So this is really important.
And I think there's also often just this kind of sense, I don't know where this comes from, but like, first research, then practice. But actually most teachers don't get into the world of research, and it goes the other way. It's first practice, then research. Like, what am I doing every day? And how is that having an impact? And what am I seeing? Okay, that raises questions that now I want to go and find out more about. We can't just wait until the research has answered all the questions and then we teach our class.
Yeah, and in that sense, that's why we insist on having teachers as researchers, because then
absolutely
cycle, right?
Yeah,
well,
absolutely. I agree.
It's time already. I'm sorry. As I said, we could be here
so
talking
much time. Oh my gosh, I know.
Yeah. So, Lou, can we take one last question from the YouTube, and then unfortunately we have to stop. It's you know.
We can do this for days.
Actually, now Danielle has a question from YouTube. Danielle, you separated one.
Yes, we have a question from Andrea. She asks, what platforms or sites do you indicate for creating authoral materials by teachers in a specific context? And I would add, what advice would you give to teachers, to school teachers, Brazilian school teachers who want to create their own pronunciation material in an ILF perspective?
Yes, so at the risk of sounding dismissive, there's a lot of information on this already on the ILFPron website that I mentioned, because those questions precisely were what drove us to put stuff there. Because when we asked those questions, there was almost nobody with an answer. So we started making our own things. So in terms of, I'll answer the easier one first, probably, which is what platforms. To be honest, I tend to just use Word and make documents and worksheets like I always would. It's just that the ingredients, let's say, are different. You know, I'll make a little activity which focuses on a particular feature of pronunciation, but it doesn't have to be really digitally amazing. It's really just about where you're focusing learners' attention. The tools and the methods are up to you. And then that's why I was sort of saying it's evolution, not revolution. You can produce things the same way as you'd always produce them, making a worksheet or a table or a picture. It's just that you might not be focusing on, I don't know, rising intonation for a question or something. You might be focusing instead on the difference between tip and chip, if that's relevant to your students. Which brings me to Danielle, your question about like particularly for students from that first language background. You sort of have to filter the lingua franca core against the phonology of their learner's first language. So, which again, if that is also your first language or you speak it very well, you have a huge advantage there because you're able to say like, okay, Brazilian Portuguese speakers often do this. Now let's just get rid of the ones that are not important for ELF intelligibility. We won't focus on those. And let's reconsider for a moment, is there anything they're doing which in an ELF context might cause problems? And that is I kind of did that for the 2 slides earlier. I was like, what does this mean for Brazilian Portuguese speakers? That's like a preliminary filtering exercise, which you can do much better. You know, your knowledge of that language background is far richer than mine. But that just to illustrate the sort of exercise that I think teachers need to do is just take those 2 things and put them together and then see what falls out. And also then just pay attention to what your class does. Like in any other context, like we go in with a sort of plan of what they need, but then they surprise us. Turns out that actually they're fine with X and they don't understand Y. So we adjust our syllabus. So whatever it is that we do to create our list of priorities, then of course we have to pay attention and it's dynamic and, you know, we might adjust what we do as we continue through the course. Great. That answers your questions.
I think, unfortunately, we have to stop. So, Laura, thanks again. It was really nice. It was really interesting. I'm glad people got to know you. I have been talking about you, but not many people knew you. But and Juliana, Lucielen, and others. Thelma, probably, you remember Thelma. Thelma has been to our conferences several times. And,
I think I know her face. I'm not always so good with names. Yeah. But.
Yeah, I think, well, she was in London, I'm sure. But anyway, so it was really nice. Thank you very much. So then I told people if they want. Thank you so much
for inviting me.
Yeah, and I told people if they want the slides. So when you send to us, so then I can share with them.
Yeah, and, I'll do it right now before I forget.
Yeah, and I'm going to thank everybody for being here with us in the room and also on the channel. So then before this, Laura, I'll give you the floor for you to say your last words. But anyway, the whole group would like to thank you for this wonderful talk but this great interaction. It was really great.
Oh, thank you, and thank you all for coming and participating. Oh, it was a pleasure. I hope we can do it in Brazil. I need to come back.
Yes,
I need to come back
absolutely.
And visit. And I've never been to Salvador, so that would be a new place for me.
Yes, yes, and please say hello to our friends in Athens if you come across. I mean, if you see them, Natasha, Nikos, and
we're in contact often. We're in lockdown now, so I won't see them in person for a while, but I'll absolutely say hi. Yeah, definitely. Yes. And thank you so much for hosting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
So, Danielle, can you stop recording, please?
It'll take 30 seconds.